Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about conditioning for pitchers, the demands of the sport, and how we go about implementing these pieces so they don't negatively impact the ultimate output. All right, I think there's essentially kind of two schools of thought and kind of two camps for people right now on the extreme ends of this. So one being, if you do any kind of conditioning at all, you're going to kill gains, we're going to make guys worse, they're not going to throw hard. And then we have the other side, right, the old school guys, let's say, where it's like, hey, we're running after starts to get rid of lactic acid, which isn't a thing in terms of impacting recovery. And then, you know, we need to be well conditioned for the ninth inning because we're going to throw 100 pitches. So we want to make sure we're really well conditioned in that regard. So the truth is somewhere in the middle. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the demands first and what all of these things kind of mean. So when we think about baseball and kind of pitching as an endeavor, it's an anaerobic alactic endeavor, okay, pitching is. So we have roughly 1 to 2 seconds of work or kind of really high output and then about 20 seconds of rest. So we've got these really short kind of high output pieces and then these pretty long rest periods, relatively speaking, from a ratio standpoint. So we're about 1 to 10 or a little bit more than that in terms of the work to rest ratio. The thing that I think we need to think about that maybe people don't consider is that during the game, pitchers are going to see heart rates in terms of 140 to 170 BPM. So they're going to get pretty high. Okay, so when we talk about, you know, what does an aerobic, a well-conditioned aerobic system do for us? It allows us to recover better between pitches. It allows us to recover better between outings, and it allows us to do more work in a given session to kind of push that development forward. Okay, so I think kind of the first piece worth covering is going to be just a review on energy systems and what that looks like. All right, so I think kind of the first thing to be aware of when it comes to energy systems is the whole thing thereafter is the synthesis and utilization of ATP. So ATP is a molecule that we use for muscle contraction and other cellular processes, okay? So I think the other thing to understand about this is that no single energy system is active on its own at any one point. They're always kind of working together, okay? And they each go by a couple of different names, so don't get hung up on that. But kind of our first energy system here is the ATP-CP system or the anaerobic alactic system here. So I think a couple of things are going to be kind of immediately clear from the name. One, we don't need oxygen for this system. And two, it's not going to produce lactate. Okay, so what's kind of happening here is essentially we'll be able to fuel muscle contraction for about 10 seconds of work. All right, and the way that's going to kind of happen, we're going to use stored ATP, and then we're going to donate a phosphate group from phosphocreatine to kind of make that happen. And this is going to be the stuff that fuels your kind of super high intensity movements. For example, like pitching, this is going to be kind of one of your primary energy systems here. All right, so next we've got the glycolytic energy system. So essentially with high intensity stuff, right? So ATP, CP, short duration, high intensity. When we get beyond the capacity of that, the glycolytic system is going to take over as kind of the primary system at that point. So a couple things are going to be a little bit different here. One, we are going to get the accumulation of lactate here. Two, we're going to use glycogen, so essentially stored carbohydrates, kind of as fuel for synthesizing ATP at this point. And we can go for about a minute in this energy system, okay? And then once we get beyond that capacity, we're going to go into the aerobic energy system. So again, something's going to be pretty clear about this. We're going to use oxygen at this point. And then this is going to be the system, like when we're doing relatively lower intensity activity, this is going to be your primary system. Okay, so essentially what's going to happen with the aerobic system is it's going to synthesize ATP in the mitochondria with oxygen, some enzymes, and then interaction with fatty acids, amino acids, or glycogen, okay? And so these are going to be kind of the main ones that you need to kind of understand when we're talking about, you know, background for why conditioning matters. Okay, so if aerobic conditioning is so great, why have poles gotten such a bad rap and why does everyone hate on them? So I think there's a couple of really important things to understand. One is that intensity is hugely important, okay? So generally when we're talking about aerobic conditioning, we're looking for 50 to 70% of max heart rate is where we're aiming to be. So essentially, you should be kind of below the talk test threshold, right? So essentially when we leave that first ventilatory threshold and go on to the second one, you can no longer speak comfortably. That's when it's gotten too intense. We're no longer doing aerobic conditioning. We're now doing lactate-based work, okay? And so what kind of happens is when we're doing aerobic conditioning, there's a lot of really positive effects effects that can happen. And so one of them is we increase capillary density. And so what this means, we can maintain body heat better, we get better blood flow and kind of nutrient delivery to soft tissues. We get all kinds of good stuff happening there. When we get to this kind of higher threshold stuff where we get into kind of this lactate based conditioning, what's going to start to happen is we're out of this kind of low intensity zone where we're going to kind of boost all of these kind of recovery pieces. Essentially, we're going to stay out of the way of our high days. We're not going to impact them negatively. And we're getting into this zone where it's essentially too high to not impact recovery and too low to really drive any meaningful speed, strength, or power adaptations. So we kind of get in this no man's land where we're not really adding to our kind of on-field output, but we're actively subtracting from our ability to actually be as high as we need to on these high days to drive meaningful stress and adaptation. One of the other issues with kind of getting out of this lower intensity zone is that we can start getting type 2 or kind of the fast twitch muscle fibers behaving like type 1 muscle fibers, kind of starting to take on their characteristic in something that's called a fiber type shift, okay? And this would have to be occurring pretty frequently over a longer period of time. One session isn't going to make this happen, so don't freak out. But if we're consistently training this way, we're not necessarily putting our best foot forward kind of on the training side to get to the highest level possible, okay? So I think a couple of things then. So how do we go about implementing this? So I think a couple things to think about. One, we want it on low days, all right? Two, we know kind of the heart rate range that we want to be in and kind of the effects that we're ultimately trying to drive. So then we have a bunch of options in terms of how we go about doing that. So what does this look like in terms of frequency? So for us, we're generally looking at 2 to 3 sessions a week in the off season, depending on needs and volume in a given session, and then kind of what else is going on in the athlete's life, okay? In season, it may look more like 1 to 2 sessions. Again, this will depend on kind of what's happening there and whether they're a starter or a reliever. All of these things can kind of impact this in meaningful ways where we'll kind of decide differently for each guy. So a couple options we have. One, tempo runs, right? So these were made famous by Charlie Francis. So essentially what you'll do, you'll run at somewhere between 60 and 75% of your max velocity, a given distance, and you'll walk back for rest. So the whole time we're essentially trying to breathe through your nose if possible, but again, should be able to talk very comfortably while you're doing this. Another option that we like a lot would be extensive plyos and tempo runs. Those pair well together, and they can work really well for guys who need more of those elastic contacts, okay? One of the issues that can arise here is if we're doing a ton of volume and we have maybe bigger guys, which we tend to get as far as pitchers go, and their running form's not great, we can have issues in terms of all of those contacts. So we may want some off-feed options, right? So we have options such as, you know, kind of the stationary bike can be one. Another one can be extensive medicine ball circuits. All right, or we can have lower intensity options like walking, hiking, sled dragging. All of those things can be great options and kind of fit into the plan as needed. Again, this can be individualized for a given athlete, but just some things to think about when we're talking about conditioning. It's not evil. In fact, we actually definitely need this because it's going to be, metabolic health is a rising tide that's going to lift all ships. So the better we are on that front, the more we can do on all of kind of the more specific pieces as we go.